This was Xi Jinping in 2018. He's got a North Korean-esque portrayal by the Chinese state media. The shades. And the next scene here, he walks with Zhang, which is the vice chair of the military. And at this point, you might think that this is 2018. Xi Jinping has concentrated all the power into his own hands, and he is untouchable. And you'll be right. Yet fast forward to 2025, there is now rumors flying that Xi Jinping may be losing his power. And is that even possible? I've made a few videos on this already, but I thought we need to do a very concentrated, very solid video explaining just the inner workings of the party to understand why it's actually possible. The reason Xi Jinping could maintain his power throughout 2022 into now through this third term, which is actually unprecedented because most CCP leaders only do 2 terms or about 10 years, is because he had done exactly that. He concentrated all of the powers onto himself. Now, previously there were many rumors that suggested CCP leadership had either passed away or that maybe like in 2022 that Xi Jinping wouldn't be re-elected. These were actually quite groundless in the sense that anyone that really knew what was going on in the CCP didn't believe them. But this time something is very different because the key factor here is his health. This is a photo from August of 2024 during a meeting by Xi Jinping with the Vietnamese not the CCP, but the Vietnamese Communist Party General Secretary To Lam. And you see behind here in the neck part, there's a 90-degree angle sharp cut on his hairline, which is very abnormal for a barber to do that if you're the leader's barber. But that line suggested that he might have suffered a stroke and he went through surgery. So let's talk about the timeline. August 2024, stroke. And then fast forward to December 2024, rumors about his closest generals being disappeared. And then forward to now, in early spring of 2025, some of those generals have been confirmed that they actually did get purged. And these were Xi Jinping's very close military people, as well as various commanders in different theaters like the Eastern, Western, and Southern Command. And then now to June 2025, well, into July, but at the end of June, there were even Western columns and opinion pieces and prominent personalities talking about this. So this is not something that just came out of thin air. For example, the latest from the New York Post column by Gregory Slayton, who is a former US diplomat, he had revealed an important detail here, which is that Xi Jinping's security staff had been cut in half. Now, this is something I've not encountered or seen anywhere else by Mandarin-speaking information sources, by people inside China that I spoke to, or by Western reports. This is a very exclusive detail that he had just seemingly brushed off as part of this overall argument. But this is something very interesting because this is not a detail that regular people would notice. This is something where it's between nations. This is a diplomatic connection that a country would have with another country, and especially it's very important for the CCP. There was a gentleman who used to work for the Belarusian diplomatic corps, and he got to interact with how they set up an event for Xi Jinping's visit to Belarus, and that intricate details and steps that they planned out, including which stairs, what part of the music they will play when Xi Jinping will walk. So this is something that is deliberately kept secret between nations to ensure the safety of, obviously, their leader. To know that detail, you would have to be someone like a former diplomat who may still have connections to those things to know. So I think it's very interesting that it does become very indicative of the level of importance for Xi Jinping if he's no longer the top leadership or the one who's actually having the final say on things, that possibly his security details would be cut in half because he no longer needs it. And even more recently, the Hong Kong chief executive, Zhang, who gave a speech for July 1st, and in this speech this year, he did not mention the goals and the policies in place by put in place by Xi Jinping, which previous years he had done repeatedly, including the former chief executive Carrie Lam, who also would always start the speech by thanking Xi Jinping. This is not something that they just randomly decided not to do or he was forgetful. This is something that he has to do because, well, obviously the current Hong Kong system and its regime is tied to the CCP in Beijing. Now, you might think that, well, Hong Kong's chief isn't even a high-ranking official on the list of the CCP. What does he know about the state of power in Beijing? Well, actually, the CCP views Hong Kong and Macau as very important since even the 80s to the 90s. The reason is most of the CCP officials' wealth actually flows out through Hong Kong. And even before the transfer of ownership back to China in 1997, the the way that they had infiltrated the city was already deep enough that when it did happen with the exchange from the British colony to China, that well, basically, it was already infiltrated and that the CCP had full control of Hong Kong from certain aspects. Now, obviously, in 2019, Xi Jinping made his personal invasion through this national security law onto Hong Kong, and that was definitely a turning point for the overall situation. But just Hong Kong is a very important aspect of when it comes to the CCP politics. And before we continue, here's the other David to tell you something important. Dear China Insider viewers, this August, I'm heading to Forest City in Malaysia, a haunting symbol of China's real estate crisis. For a 7-day investigation, I'll be exploring the ghost city and speaking and interviewing with people in Malaysia and Singapore about the Chinese crisis in its real estate politics, as well as the general perception in Southeast Asia. My goal is to expose the growing influence of the Chinese Communist Party there. Your support will make this journey possible, powering China Insider to deliver unfiltered and bold truth. So why am I going? Well, it's probably the only place outside of China where we can witness the entirety of the Belt and Road Initiative from its rise to the downfall, the decade of Xi Jinping's ambition, and possibly witness the beginning and the end of the CCP's economic might. I am once again asking for your financial support. Sorry, that was my best Bernie impersonation. But in all seriousness, by donating, you become the driving force behind our mission with China Insider going to Southeast Asia. And here is how you can join us. While we're so grateful for any amount of donation that you can provide to us for this journey, if you donate $15, you will receive a personalized thank you letter from me. By donating $35, you receive a personalized thank you letter from me and exclusive behind-the-scenes photos of this trip, which will capture moments you'll never see anywhere else. By donating $65, you will get a digital book packed with outtakes, unseen footage, and my personal reflection, offering a raw insider look into the ghost city and all of its former glory. It also includes all of the $35 tier donation rewards. And if you donate $100 or more, you will receive exclusive, never-for-sale merchandise from China Insider specifically tailored for this trip, which is a unique keepsake for our top supporters, plus all of the previous tier rewards. Your generosity will fund the equipment, travel, and production of this trip, and we just can't thank you enough for sticking with us for the journey so far, and we hope to bring you all of the best stories around China, and this trip definitely will be one that's worth remembering, so join us on the journey and donate today. Let's specifically talk about the mindset here. We tend to fall into this belief that if there was a coup or if there was a takeover, a power shift, it will be a violent, sudden one, that within, say, 48 hours, we would know the results, that we would know that Xi Jinping has been kicked out and that a new person will be in power. But that's really not how it works in the CCP. That's not the norm. Another point that people seem to think is that elder politics, former top leaders no longer have influence in the Xi Jinping era. The analogy I can give you is that people often talk about how Obama is the most influential person inside the Democratic Party, and that even, when he left office and that he was still probably having a lot of inputs into maybe even the candidates, the nominees, etc., etc. Or we could say that Trump is the most influential person in the Republican Party. Even if he wasn't the president, he would still have a huge amount of influence through candidate choices, nominees, etc. Right? So that's kind of the elder politics, so to speak, of the American version. But in China, elder politics means something like former revolutionary leaders, retired CCP general secretaries, etc. So let's first talk about why this so-called sudden change is not a norm. In fact, there's actually only one instance in the history of the CCP power politics that it was very sudden. It was the Deng Xiaoping removal of the Gang of Four. Right? The Gang of Four was essentially the squad of 4 people, including Madame Mao, who is the wife of Mao Zedong, that was doing the Cultural Revolution. And even after Mao died, what they tried to do was continuing Mao's in spirit of his version and beliefs of the CCP to try to impose power upon everything else. But that was the only time where it was a violent, sudden takeover, change in power. The rest of it was always a very chronic series of events. For example, even Mao Zedong's power struggle against Liu Shaoqi, who Mao basically was forced out of power after the Great Famine and the Great Leap Forward, and that Liu Shaoqi was the paramount leader at the time. What Mao had done was, although it later turned violent, initially it was through a series of political campaigns and essentially different political movements that would rile up the population, because Mao Zedong was an elder. He was a revolutionary leader, and he had the influence and the status to appeal to people in that way. So even though on paper it was a takeover, but it was done through a series of these political campaigns that eventually transferred power back to Mao Zedong, and that obviously culminated in the Cultural Revolution. But that was not a sudden takeover. And Deng Xiaoping is another great example. Hua Guofeng is somebody who was the direct appointee after Mao Zedong had died in terms of keeping power, and Deng Xiaoping stripped Hua Guofeng of his authorities over a span of 3 years. In that time, Hua Guofeng was still the head of state. He was still doing visits. He was still doing all sorts of things that the leaders would do. And nobody seemed to have realized that he was not the one who has the final say anymore until at one point he got stripped of his power. He was officially announced that it was over for him. And then that's when people realized, oh, crap, things are changing. Okay, and then let's move on to elder politics. Now, people seem to believe that after Xi Jinping's third term, elders don't have any influence at all, that they've been carefully watched. I even cover this, that they were surveilled ahead of these meetings at Beidaihe, which is where they can gather for an annual retreat. So the fact that there's elder politics or influence in the era of Xi Jinping, that's completely over, is an argument that we're still seeing today. Now, the reason why this is not necessarily the case is because elder politics is a norm. It's part of the history of the CCP. It's not a one-off instance, right? Like I just mentioned, Mao Zedong was an elder. Deng Xiaoping was an elder. And even after, for example, when Jiang Zemin had retired from his political roles, he still held a military position, and he was effectively still the final decision maker in some instances when Hu Jintao came into power. The only instance in which elder politics stopped was when Hu Jintao officially retired from all three roles, and it was called a naked retirement because he literally stopped holding on to power. That was the only case. So throughout all of history, elders have played an important part in the CCP's political circles and even decision-making at times. So that brings me to the point with how 2025 and Xi Jinping's rumors shaped out. The key is health, right? We just understand that there is possibility of a stroke. When that happens, just look at what Xi Jinping has done over the past decade. He put every decision into his own hand. In other words, he has to control every final decision. Everyone around him, that these officials who have been, promoted like they're riding on a rocket into these key positions and key cabinet roles, have never built up a power base or have actually been more than just an employee of Xi Jinping. They don't have decision-making powers. So if Xi Jinping suddenly collapsed in a stroke or something like that, and maybe it's a day or two, who knows? Who's going to make the decisions? You can't stop running the country. That's when people could invite these elders to come out and play a big role in managing the situation. And that's what I think happened, is because, sure, these elders are not as influential as, say, Deng Xiaoping or Mao Zedong was, but they're still part of this well-established power base, the establishment that has been built up over the last decades that are much more influential, much more powerful, and much, well, I guess you would say, well-respected than those people that were riding on rockets into promotions by Xi Jinping. And that's precisely the nature of Xi Jinping's power base, which is that because everything was done through anti-corruption purges, he's pretty much hated by every other faction. And so when something goes wrong, everyone is out to take the opportunity to seize the chaos and to get him. And that's really, it's very natural in the CCP to do that. Unlike what happened with Mao Zedong or Stalin, for example, even when the guy was unconscious or dying, or when Mao was bedridden, nobody dared to end him or to turn things around because they were so afraid of what that person, not just his person, but his name and everything around him, that was just so shocking and fearful to them that they wouldn't dare to do anything. But Xi Jinping doesn't have that. He's not as personally achieved or as respected as the other CCP elders. So there's nothing like people stopping from ending his life or whatnot in those scenarios. But I'm just trying to say the point is you can't compare him to Mao. And another point about elder politics is that, remember, the most prominent example of this is Deng Xiaoping's establishment of the Central Advisory Council, which effectively means even though he didn't hold much of the real powers, the titles, so to speak, he was the one who had the final say because, yes, sure, he didn't attend all the Politburo meetings, but he was the one who basically, you had to listen to, you had to consult for the final decision. So let's move on to the military, because this is a very important point. We know that the PLA is the party's military. It listens to the top leadership, which is a civilian leader, usually the general secretary, or in the case of the military, the chair of the Central Military Commission. But the military also has an independent system where they can choose who to follow depending on the situation. The great example of this is when Deng Xiaoping retired and handed power to Jiang Zemin. Zhang wanted to go back on reform and opening up. So he wanted to go back to this very extreme leftist way of, let's say, Mao Zedong. And then what happened was Deng Xiaoping was doing a southern tour. The military, the PLA Daily, published a column, an editorial piece, saying that reform and opening up must continue, that the military was ready to protect that. Okay? After that paper came out, Zhang was scared, crapless, because he knew that the military still sided with Deng Xiaoping. So he didn't dare to do anything policy-wise to change that, and he had to continue. So that's what you can see here is when situations are dire, they can choose to side with who they think is their version of the right future. Because the CCP will never have a military takeover. They won't have this idea where it's ruled by a junta, that kind of thing, right? Like in Myanmar or in Burma. But what they will do is the PLA is always going to have an opportunity to listen to a civilian leader in the case of decision making. Currently, we think that Zhang Youxia, the vice chair, the guy that you saw in the video in the beginning, is the one that's controlling the military, but he can't become the leader. He has to listen to a civilian leader. So his choice, if he decided to choose to listen to the elders who are more respected, well, then Xi Jinping has effectively lost the military power. So in the end, Xi Jinping would become a figurehead, which is, again, is not the first case in the CCP. Hua Guofeng was one that basically got his power stripped. You had Zhao Ziyang, who was made premier, then made general secretary, also didn't have the final say. And you had Hu Yaobang, obviously, was also put into place by Deng Xiaoping again. So these are at least 3 other examples outside of Xi Jinping that has had this done to them. Now, could Xi Jinping have fought back? Very possible. In fact, I think he did multiple times, maybe even, because what we've seen so far is a continuous series of military generals and top military officials that are very close to Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping put them in place, or they were installed after a series of corruption purges inside the military. So these are Xi Jinping's own people that are now getting purged from the party, including the most famous ones, Ho Weidong, the second vice chair of the military, Mao Hua, who is the political commissar of the Central Military Commission. So these are people that are very closely tied to Xi that have now met their demise. And that only tells me that Xi Jinping likely fought back and he likely failed. Maybe it could even be a decision where elders initially wanted to coexist with Xi Jinping, still let him be in power, still have, just consult them when it comes to the final decision making. But Xi Jinping thought that this was a life or death situation, so maybe he tried to fight back and then he lost. That very much possible. So I wouldn't discount that either, because right now we see the situation with the Chinese military is that it is rapidly shifting for the worse for the Xi faction. Now, I'm not saying all this could be seen tomorrow. In fact, I think we might not even see this till the fall at the earliest for the 4th plenum, or maybe even worse, we could not see this till 2027. But I think the point is that there's too many circumstantial evidence, let's not call them direct evidence, circumstantial evidence, and these are stacked up against Xi Jinping's power. And it might not seem like it on the surface, but when you realize that, well, it's already been done. Again, my point here is that this is not something to cheer for. We're not going to crack open a bottle of champagne, but what we are seeing is that clearly if the CCP is trying to remove Xi, it means that they're, trying to change. And I just hope that, again, I'll say this, if the CCP doesn't collapse, it doesn't matter, because there's always the opportunity for them to breed somebody again like Xi or Mao, and that's just not how things go. So my obviously final goal objective is to see the fall of the CCP, because that is really the problem, right? It doesn't matter if it's Xi Jinping or whoever else. At the end of the day, they're just the product of the bad crop, which is the CCP. So thank you so much for watching this episode of Elite Politics. Hope you enjoyed it. Leave a comment on your thoughts and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.